So let's begin with a few minutes of silence. And then see if you can generate a positive, altruistic motivation for being here, part of this class, learning about the path to enlightenment. So really feel you're doing this not just for your own benefit, but for the benefit of other beings, all other beings if possible. And also try to feel you're not doing it just for short-term benefit, just happiness and well-being in this present life. But if you can think of a more long-term benefit, helping other beings be free of the very causes of suffering and help them achieve every kind of happiness up to the highest happiness of enlightenment. So we are in the last part of the Lamrim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, looking at Yangtze Rinpoche's book, Practicing the Path. And I have to admit, I have not read this book before. It's the first time that I read it. Venerable Yunten is the one who suggested using this book. And so in this reading, the pages that I recommended to read for this this week's class, you may have found a number of difficult things that were difficult to understand, maybe even confusing. I also found things in that section that I had difficulty understanding. So there were kind of many difficult points, but we don't have time to go through all of the points he brought up, but I'll just focus on some of the points that that I do feel that I understand and I can go through. Also, in this book, Practicing the Path, Yangtze Rinpoche was giving commentary, teachings to a text by Lama Tsongkhapa, which is called The Great Exposition of the Stages of the Path, Lamrim Chenmo, which is a really huge book. And just this last section of his text, which is talking about the perfection of wisdom, how to develop wisdom, that itself is quite huge. In the English translation of that text, that section takes up 250 pages. So it's like a whole book in itself. And so, and it's very difficult material. It's very complex, very difficult. So even scholars have difficulty going through it. And so Yangtze Rinpoche was, talking about that, and he probably had a limited amount of time. And so he wasn't able to cover all the points. So just understand that it is a very difficult topic. And if you don't understand everything about it, it's quite normal. It is difficult to understand, even for great scholars. Okay, so I sent you, or you should have received the slides for today. So we'll just go through those. The first slide says the importance of wisdom. And there's a quotation here, a verse from another text of Lama Tsongkhapa, which is just a short one. It's called The Three Principal Aspects of the Path. I don't know if you've come across that one before. Maybe one of the other teachers has taught it to you. Anyway, this is one of the verses from that text. And it says, even if you meditate upon the determination to be free, which is another way of saying renunciation, and the altruistic intention, or bodhicitta, without the wisdom realizing the ultimate nature, you cannot cut the root of cyclic existence. Therefore, strive for the means to realize dependent arising. And so this is quite relevant to what we have been doing, because, you know, going through the Lamrim, and there's the three different scopes, three different levels, the initial and the middle and the great. And so in the initial and the middle level of the Lamrim, the topic is mainly renunciation, determination to free ourselves from samsara, this whole world, this whole existence of suffering, unsatisfactoriness, confusion, and so on. So that's the meaning of renunciation, just seeing that the situation we are in is very imperfect, full of problems, and generating the strong wish or determination to free ourselves from it. You know, so the first part of the Lamrim is about that, how to develop renunciation. And then the great scope, which we've been doing in the last couple of months, this is all about how to develop bodhicitta so that we extend our wish to be free of suffering to others as well. So instead of just thinking, I want to get out of suffering, I want to be free of suffering, but we realize all other beings want to be free of suffering too. And we take on the job, the responsibility of helping them be free. So that's the altruistic intention, bodhicitta. So it's wonderful to meditate on these topics and generate these states of mind. However, Lama Tsongkhapa is saying that just with that alone, just with determination to be free and bodhicitta, you will not cut the root of cyclic existence, meaning you will not become free of cyclic existence. You need this third factor, which is the wisdom realizing the ultimate nature. Another way of saying wisdom realizing emptiness. So if we want to be free of samsara ourselves, and if we want to help other sentient beings be free of samsara, we have to generate this wisdom. Then he goes on to say, and strive for the means to realize dependent arising. So dependent arising is one of the main methods or ways to gain the wisdom realizing emptiness. Okay, so then the next slide is has the title "The Perfection of Wisdom." So this just has some general information about this sixth perfection, the last of the six perfections. So the perfection of wisdom, this is taught in the Lamrim by way of developing special insight or Vipassana into emptiness. So the word Vipassana, I think for many people, when they hear Vipassana, they think of Goenka, because Goenka Goenkaji developed this this way of meditating based on the Buddhist teachings, of course. But I think a lot of people do it who are not necessarily Buddhist. You don't really have to be Buddhist to do Vipassana courses. And so his courses are very, very popular, even though he's passed away now, but they're still continuing and they're extremely popular. So a lot of people think Vipassana means Goenka's style of meditation, which is true because the real purpose of doing that kind of meditation is to gain insight, understanding of the true nature of things, such as impermanence, things are changing all the time, and unsatisfactoriness or dukkha, how our ordinary experiences are not real happiness, but are just another kind of dukkha. And then selflessness, non-self. So that's the real purpose of doing that kind of practice. But there are different ways of developing vipassana or insight into the true nature of things. And in the Tibetan tradition, or at least in the Gelug tradition, the way of developing special insight, vipassana, is that you first have to study, you have to listen to teachings and study and think and develop a correct conceptual understanding of emptiness, because emptiness is very difficult to understand. It's a very subtle object, and it's not something easily recognized or easily understood. So you have to first study a lot to understand emptiness conceptually. And then on top of that, we have to meditate on what we understand. And ideally, you use very strong concentration, like calm abiding. I noticed in the previous chapter of this book, the chapter on concentration or calm abiding, Yangtze Rinpoche said that emptiness is a very subtle object. It's something quite subtle. And to be able to understand emptiness, we also need a subtle mind. We need to develop a certain type of mind that is quite subtle. If we try to understand emptiness with a gross, coarse level of mind, then it's difficult, it's challenging. And so with developing calm abiding, this very, very strong kind of concentration, that is a subtle mind. Calm abiding is a more subtle mind. And so with that subtle mind, it's easier to understand emptiness and realize emptiness, not just understand it conceptually, but actually get a realization of it. And so that's the real meaning of Vipassana in the Gelug tradition, the Tibetan tradition. It's developing two things. One is a conceptual understanding of emptiness, understanding it on the conceptual level. And the other thing is calm abiding, this very strong, single-pointed concentration. So you develop those things separately, and then you put them together. You combine using this very subtle mind of calm abiding and analyzing your understanding of emptiness. And when you are able to unite those two things, they call it the union of calm abiding and special insight, or shamatha, vipassana. That's the actual meaning of special insight. The union of calm abiding and special insight on emptiness. I mean, you can develop special insight on other things. It doesn't have to be emptiness. You can develop special insight with regard to impermanence or the Four Noble Truths. So there's different things you can have special insight about. But the main object to develop special insight, Vipassana, is emptiness. because it's only by understanding emptiness that we will be able to become free of all our suffering and the causes of suffering. So emptiness is a very important object. And the second bullet point says, according to Madhyamaka Prasangika, that's the school we mainly follow, emptiness of inherent existence is the actual way everything exists. It's ultimate truth. So this isn't new to you. You must have heard this many times before, that emptiness is like a quality, a characteristic of everything that exists. Our bodies, our minds, our own self, I, other people, people we like, people we don't like, people we don't know, all people, all beings, all the things in the world around us, all the things in the universe. So everything, samsara, nirvana, everything, whatever exists, from the tiniest particle of matter to the whole universe itself, all of these things have emptiness as their true way of existing, the actual way of existing. And it means emptiness of inherent existence, this certain kind of certain way of existing, which our mind falsely imputes or projects onto things. Okay, so that's the meaning of emptiness. That's the object we're trying to understand in the perfection of wisdom. And then the next bullet point says, the wisdom that directly realizes this emptiness is the antidote to the ignorance that grasps things as inherently existing, which is the root of samsara. So all living beings, including ourselves and everybody else, even the most intelligent, well-educated, brilliant people, all of us have within our minds this ignorance about the true nature of things. It's, according to Buddhism, it's been in our mind forever, from beginningless time. It didn't start coming into our mind at a certain point, and before that we didn't have it, but it's always been there, always been in our mind. We've never been free of it. So it's just like something almost stuck to our mind, glued to our mind, carried with our mind from one life to another. And this ignorance that grasps things as inherently existent, I mean, there's other kinds of ignorance, but this is the main one, the worst one, the worst affliction, mental affliction. And it's sometimes called the root of samsara. Just like the root of a tree is the source for the whole tree, including the trunk and the branches and the leaves and the flowers and the fruit. Whatever grows on the tree, it all comes from the root. So in a similar way, samsara, with all the different experiences, all the different phenomena and things that happen in samsara, all of them have their root in ignorance, this ignorance about the true nature of things. So as long as that exists in our mind and we're not free of it, we will continue to have samsara. We will continue to experience samsara and all the different painful experiences, and even the pleasant. There are pleasant experiences in samsara, beautiful things to see and hear, beautiful music and delicious foods and smells and so on, nice feelings in our body. So all the different wonderful experiences in samsara. So even these are considered another kind of suffering, another kind of unsatisfactoriness, because they don't last. They're momentary, they last a short time, then they disappear. We're left feeling dissatisfied. What happened? Where did that wonderful experience go? Why isn't it not still there? I was just thinking about that because we just had Christmas in America 2 days ago, and When I was a child, oh, Christmas was the most wonderful day. It's like you look forward to it the whole year. Mainly because of attachment. Yeah. Getting presents and eating special foods and having beautiful Christmas trees. I mean, there's a lot of nice things about Christmas, but you look forward to it for a long time. And then finally there's Christmas. Christmas arrives and it's a nice day. But then the next day, oh, it's over. Christmas is over. And then you start looking forward to the next Christmas, 364 days away. So that's it with samsaric pleasures. They last for a little while and then they're gone. And then your mind just grasps at the next one and the next one and the next one. Is never completely satisfied, never completely happy and free of suffering. So that's the nature of samsara. So all the experiences in samsara, both the good ones and the bad ones, they all have their root in ignorance. And so if we can see that samsara is unsatisfactory and we want to get out of samsara and we want to help other beings get out of samsara, we must eliminate this root of samsara, this ignorance about the way things exist. And so the antidote, the only antidote to this ignorance is the wisdom that realizes emptiness. So you've heard that before, but it doesn't hurt to hear it again. Yeah. And so then the last bullet point says, one form of this ignorance. So we have this ignorance about everything, everything that exists. But one form of this ignorance is grasping I and mine as inherently existent. And this grasping is also known as the view of the transitory collection. I don't know if you've heard that term before. Has anyone mentioned that term before?
Oh.
I'm bringing it up because Yangtze Rinpoche does mention it in the book. And if you do read books of Buddhist philosophy, you do encounter this term. So it sounds kind of complicated, view of transitory collection, but what it's just this ignorance with regard to our own self, I, me. The reason it's called that, the reason it has this long name, view of the transitory collection, the transitory collection refers to our aggregates, our body and mind. So this mass of physical and mental components that make us up as a living being, a human being. This is called a transitory collection. It's a collection because there's many different things, and it's transitory because it's impermanent. It's changing every moment, every tiny nanosecond. So the transitory collection refers to our aggregates of body and mind. And the view here is, it's actually explained differently by different Buddhist schools. So all the different Buddhist schools do talk about the view of the transitory collection, but the way they explain it would be different. But we'll just look at Prasangika. So according to Prasangika, the view of the transitory collection observes our aggregates. Actually, it doesn't observe our aggregates. It observes the mere I, the merely labeled I, which is the conventional I, the I that exists, that which is merely labeled to our aggregates. So the view of the transitory collection looks at that merely labeled I, which does exist, and exaggerates it. It misunderstands the merely labeled I and thinks that it's an inherently existing I, an independent, objective, real kind of I, which doesn't exist. Okay, so so it's like looking at something that does exist, but seeing it in a mistaken way. other than how it really is. So, a good analogy, I like this analogy, and it's probably something that works for you as well, living in Israel, the analogy of a mirage. So I'm sure you've all seen a mirage. This is something that happens in a desert or in some place that's very dry and hot. And when you have those conditions, you have the surface, the surface of the desert, and it's very, very dry. And then you have the hot sun overhead shining on top of this dry surface. So it produces this appearance, kind of looks like silvery, shimmery light, and it looks like water. Yeah, it actually looks like water. And you could be fooled into thinking there is water. There's a pool of water or a river or a lake or something. You could swear there's water there, but there isn't. There's no water. Not even a drop of water. So, but there's still that appearance created by these conditions, the dry surface of the ground, and then the hot sun and the hot air. So due to those conditions, there is this appearance. So we do see, it is an object of our eye consciousness, that we call it a mirage, but that kind of shimmering appearance, that does exist. But then our mind will mistakenly superimpose onto that appearance water. There's water there. We think there's real water there, but it's not. It's just an appearance, but not real. So it's kind of similar with our eye. Okay, so we do have our aggregates of body and mind, physical and mental components constantly changing. Those do exist. And there is an I, a self, a person who's just labeled onto these aggregates. So those do exist. But then ignorance superimposes a real I. Like we think there's a real I, a solid, objectively existing I in relation to our body and our mind and our conventional I. And normally we don't investigate, we don't question, we just go along with that. But that seemingly real I, just like the seemingly real water that appears, isn't true. It's just an appearance. And if we investigate, we look carefully, we will realize that it doesn't exist. So it sounds not too complicated, not too difficult if you use an analogy like the mirage. However, it is more difficult because our sense of I is so strong and deeply rooted and habitual. And yeah, and also it's more subtle. I mean, in the desert, you can easily walk or travel to where you see this water, seemingly real water, and you can see, oh, there's no water there. So we can see it with our eyes. But when it comes to ourself, that's more subtle. That's not something we can see with our eyes. It's more, it's a mental thing. And so it's more difficult to examine. But anyway, that's just an analogy that helps understand the view of the transitory collection. So it's kind of similar to seeing a mirage and believing it to be real water. So it sees our merely labeled I on top of our aggregates and believes it to be a real I, an inherently existing I. Okay, so the next slide talks about stages of realizing emptiness. So, I forgot, lost my place. So first it says, ignorance about ourself or I gives rise to the three poisonous minds: greed, hatred, ignorance. The six root delusions, which are the three poisonous minds, plus arrogance, doubt, deluded doubt, wrong views. So all these afflictive states of mind arise from ignorance. And then these afflicted states of mind are the conditions for suffering in our own lives and others' lives. So just having these afflictions in our mind, that's already a kind of suffering. They're very disturbing. Then, under the influence of these afflictive states of mind, we sometimes do things, act, create karma, and that karma brings suffering and problems, both short term and long term, and for ourselves and for others. So that's how ignorance about ourself is the root of samsara, the root of suffering. The next bullet point says we need to recognize how the nominal or conventional I exists and distinguish this from an inherently existing I, which does not exist. Okay, so this is what Yangtze Rinpoche said in the book. We need to be able to understand the difference between the I that does exist, conventional I, and the I that doesn't exist, inherently existing I. And the next bullet point says the nominal I or conventional I is what is merely labeled independence on our aggregates. So you've heard that before. This is something we've talked about before, and you probably meditated on it as well. But it's actually not easy to understand the merely labeled I. It's not how we normally think of our I. We don't think of our I as something merely labeled. We think of our I as a real thing existing from its own side. It seems like that. It seems to be like that. And our habit is to just go along with that, not question it. So, trying to investigate our I, how does our I exist, is itself very difficult, very challenging. It's not what we normally do. And it's also not part of our education system, what we've learned from our parents, what we've learned from our teachers, and all the years of study and so on. We don't learn to question our I. What is the I? How does the I exist? So it's like a really new question, a new kind of analysis that we've probably never done before. So it's so like, what? It's not easy. But also it's said that in order to really understand how our I does exist, how it is merely labeled in relation to our aggregates, to really understand that, we have to first understand emptiness. Because whenever we think of I, or say I, or feel I, it always feels like an inherently existing I. So we're just so kind of addicted to seeing our I as inherently existing, which is the opposite to being merely labeled. And so it's very difficult to step back from that, to look at that objectively and be able to understand that. So it's only after we realize emptiness, after we realize that there is no inherently existing I. Inherently existing I is something non-existent, totally false. Only after we have that realization can we really understand how our I is merely labeled. But we can still at least try to understand that, get some kind of conceptual understanding of that, and just understand that there is a difference between these two kinds of I's. The I that exists inherently, which is false, and the I that is nominal or conventional, merely labeled. So yeah, an example I already talked about. An example is seeing a mirage as water. So we could use examples like that to at least get a conceptual understanding that the way our I appears as real, existing inherently, objectively, that's actually a false appearance, in the same way that on the desert, on the surface of the desert, there's this appearance of water, even though there isn't any water there. So that can give us some understanding of this kind of situation. Then the last bullet point on this page says, to realize emptiness, we need to develop 3 wisdoms. You've probably heard this before, but I'm mentioning it again. Young Rinpoche mentioned it. They talk about these 3 kinds of wisdom. One arises from listening. So from hearing about emptiness, hearing explanations of emptiness, but also reading books if they do present correct information. So we get some wisdom. It's like a really basic wisdom, having some understanding of what emptiness means. Then the second step is contemplation. So that can include thinking about it on our own, but also discussing with others, so that we get a deeper understanding of what emptiness means. And then the last step is meditation. So once we've done the first 2 steps, we've listened and studied, contemplated, so we have a fairly good intellectual understanding of emptiness, then we apply it in meditation. We do meditation, and then our understanding of emptiness becomes even deeper and stronger. And this is a long process and an ongoing process. You have to do these 3 steps again and again and again for a long time, even many lifetimes, maybe, unless you're lucky. No, it's not a question of luck, but yeah, some people kind of quickly understand emptiness and get a realization of emptiness, but it's probably because they were already familiar with it in past lives, and then in this lifetime they just need a little bit of effort, a little bit of work to realize it. But yeah, if we're not at that point, then we do need to keep going through these 3 steps again and again and again. Okay, so then then the 2 truths. So in the book, Yangtze Rinpoche goes through the other Buddhist schools, the 4 Buddhist schools, and talks about how they explain the 2 truths. We did that already in year 3. I was your teacher for that year, both semesters. Oh, no, sorry. Year 3, semester B, the second semester of year 3 and the first semester of year 4. So I was your teacher at that time. And we looked at the 4 different schools and how they explain the 2 truths. So you might still have notes from that. You can look at those. So we don't have time to go through that again. So I'll just focus on the Prasangika. And so according to the Prasangika school, ultimate truths are emptinesses of inherent existence. And I put it in the plural here because emptiness is a quality, a characteristic of everything that exists. And so there's actually many emptinesses rather than just one emptiness that sort of pervades everything. But everything, every phenomena has its own emptiness, its own ultimate way of existing. And another term used for emptiness is sometimes selflessness. So emptiness is the true nature of everything that exists. There's nothing that isn't empty of inherent existence. So that's ultimate truth. And then everything else that's not an emptiness is a conventional truth. So that includes, for example, our bodies, our minds, living beings, people, animals, and so on, cars, phones, buildings, trees. So everything that exists that isn't emptiness is a conventional truth. And the next bullet point says, conventional truths are not really truths, but are falsities, because they don't exist as they appear. They appear inherently or independently existing, but in fact, they don't exist that way. So in Buddhist philosophy, they use the term truth. The word truth isn't just some abstract idea, but it's an actual phenomenon, something that exists. And something is said to be true or a truth if the way it appears and the way it exists are concordant, are the same. For example, real money. Okay, so I'll just use dollars. It's a universal currency, dollars, US dollars. So there's real dollars, bills, pieces of paper that were made by the United States Treasury. And so that's real money, just in a conventional sense. But anyway, true. So a real $100 bill is a truth in a way, because it looks real and it is real. There's concordance between the way it looks and the way it exists. But there's also counterfeit money. So people produce what looks like real money, but not real, because it hasn't been produced by the right company, the United States Treasury, and so on and so forth. So they try to make it look as real as possible, but it's not, it's fake. And there's ways you can tell that it's fake, counterfeit. So a counterfeit $100 bill is an example of a falsity. It looks real, but it's not real. If you look carefully with the right knowledge, you can tell, oh, this isn't real, this is fake. So that's the meaning of truth and falsity. A real $100 bill is a truth, and a counterfeit $100 bill is a falsity. So conventional truths are actually falsities, because even though they look real, they look like they exist inherently, independently, but they don't. There's something false there in the way they appear. So, for example, a car, if we have a car, when we look at a car, it looks like it's inherently existing. There's an inherently existing car, an independently existing car. That's how it appears. It appears inherently, independently existing. But that way of appearing is actually false. It doesn't exist that way. Completely false, completely mistaken. So this is the case with conventional truths. They always appear, well, at least to us ordinary beings who haven't realized emptiness. When they appear one way, inherently existing, but the reality is they don't exist that way. And the Tibetan term for conventional truth, it literally means, and Yangtze Rinpoche mentioned this, a totally obscured truth, or a truth for a totally obscured mind, which is ignorance. So the literal meaning of a conventional truth is it's true only for an obscured mind, a deluded mind, which is ignorance. So ignorance thinks conventional truths are truths, but ignorance is wrong, not a valid mind. So the next slide just gives an example. Tibetans, when they use examples, they usually use things like a pot or a vase. That's what Yangtze Rinpoche uses in the book. And that's because they tend to have those kind of things around them. They use them in their rituals. So they use that as an example. But I thought maybe a phone is a better example for us, because most people have a phone either in their hand or in their pocket or on the table next to them. It's always nearby. So we use a phone. So a phone is a conventional truth. And it's called a conventional truth because it appears inherently or independently existing, but it's not. Especially if it's a really nice phone. I don't know if this is an iPhone or not, but when people see an iPhone, especially the newest iPhone, they get really excited and think, wow, what a cool phone. I want one of those, and do anything to get that new iPhone. So when we see a nice phone like that, it seems like it's inherently, independently, really, truly existing. That's how it appears, but it doesn't exist that way. So it's a conventional, the phone itself is a conventional truth. And then, as a quality of the phone, there is the emptiness of inherent existence, emptiness of existing inherently or independently. So that is a quality of the phone. And it's right there in the phone. It's part of the phone, not separate from the phone. We just don't see it because we haven't yet realized emptiness. But it's there. And that's the ultimate truth, the ultimate truth of the phone. And we can understand the ultimate truth of the phone by contemplating how it's dependent. It's dependent, not independent. So there's three ways that things can be dependent on causes and conditions. So obviously, a phone was made in a factory, probably in China, by people using different components, different materials, different tools, machinery, so many different causes and conditions for this phone to be produced, to come into existence. So it's dependent on those causes and conditions. And therefore, it can't be independently existing. And it's also dependent on parts. It's made of many, many, many different parts, plastic and metal and different screws and wires, and I don't know what else they make phones out of, but anyway, many different parts. So again, without those parts, the phone wouldn't exist. It's completely dependent on its parts. So those two ways that things depend are not very difficult to understand. The third one, on mental labeling, that's more difficult to understand. We have to think about that. But in relation to all these parts, components put together by people in a factory, the name phone is given, or let's say iPhone. Okay, iPhone is given to that. There's nothing within all of the parts that is an iPhone or a phone. Okay, none of the parts individually is a phone. So if we take it apart, we look through all the parts, we're not going to find a phone there. Anything we can point to and say, that is the phone. But when you put all the parts together, and we call it phone or iPhone or Samsung Galaxy or whatever, it just has a name, an arbitrary name that was just invented by whoever invented the phone. They just said, let's call it this. That's a nice name. That's a cool name. That's cool. So it's just named or labeled in relation to its parts rather than something coming from the parts. There's nothing coming from the side of the parts that is phone or iPhone or Samsung Galaxy, or whatever it's called. So I can see I'm not going to be able to cover everything I plan to, but let's just quickly look at the next slide. We may not cover all of this, but anyway, we'll go as much as we can. And so you've probably heard this before, the importance of identifying the object of negation. So whenever we're talking about emptiness or selflessness, there's always an object of negation. That means what it is we are refuting, what it is we are negating, what it is things are empty of. Okay, if we say the phone is empty, emptiness of the phone, then there's something it's empty of, and that is in this case inherent existence. Okay, that's the object of negation, inherent existence. But Yangtze Rinpoche, and it's actually in Lama Tsongkhapa's original text, he said there's actually two objects of negation in understanding emptiness. One is a subject. Subject here meaning mind or consciousness. It's an aspect of our mind. And specifically, the subject is ignorance, grasping things as inherently existing. So this does exist. What that means is this mind, this ignorance, grasping things as inherently existing, that does exist. We do have that in our minds. It exists in the minds of all sentient beings, except those who've directly realized emptiness and have eliminated ignorance from their minds. But everybody else who hasn't gotten to that point still has ignorance in their mind. So that does exist. The second object of negation is the object. The object meaning inherent existence. So that's what appears to this ignorance. And that does not exist. So inherent existence, even though we talk about it, and even though it appears to our mind, and our mind grasps at it, but in reality it doesn't exist. It's totally false, like the water in the Mirage. Okay, the Mirage exists. There is the appearance of shimmering on the desert, but even though it appears to be water, there is no water. Water doesn't exist. It's just a false appearance. So in the same way, we do have ignorance in our minds that sees things as inherently existing and believes things to be inherently existing. We do have that. That does exist. But what appears to that mind, what we grasp at, inherent existence, does not exist. So that's interesting, that, there is an object of negation that does exist, but also an object of negation that doesn't exist. But we still have to negate both of them. We still have to get rid of both of them. Both need to be rejected. And then there's, I'll just briefly mention it, but we'll continue next week. Two mistakes that we can make. Over negation. That's when we negate too much. And we negate conventional existence along with inherent existence. Yangtze Rinpoche actually spends quite a bit of time talking about that, because there were in Tibet, in the early days in Tibet, there were masters who made this mistake. They negated too much. When they negated inherent existence, they also negated existence, saying things like, oh, the car or the vase or whatever doesn't exist inherently. And what that means is it doesn't exist at all. It doesn't even exist conventionally. So Lama Tsongkhapa actually spent a lot of time discussing this problem, because it was relevant at his time. There was this view that emptiness means nothingness. Emptiness means nothing exists, even conventionally. So they went too far. Some of those old masters went too far and negated everything. And then there's the other mistake is under negation, not negating enough. So we've run out of time, so we'll stop there, but I will continue next week and discuss or just explain a little bit about those 2 points. And then, so for next week is our last class. And so the main reading I would like you to do is page 463 to 483, which is 20 pages. So that's the last section of the chapter and the conclusion to the whole book. So read that. And then the other pages, I kind of skipped over about 12 pages. You can read that if you want, it's optional. but it's talking about the difference between the Svatantrika and the Prasangika. It is important, but it's also kind of complicated. So I won't go into that because we probably won't have time. So I'll just mainly focus on our view. The Prasangika view. So that's the end of our time. So let's just take a moment to mentally dedicate the positive energy of coming together with an altruistic intention, the wish to benefit all living beings and free them from suffering. And listening to this material, which is very, very difficult, but very, very important and precious. So just making the effort to listen and learn about emptiness and try to understand it is very beneficial for ourselves and others. So we've definitely created some merit, good karma. And let's share this with other beings. May it be the cause for all living beings to be free of ignorance and all other causes of suffering, and attain genuine peace and happiness up to the highest happiness of enlightenment.